I watched through my office window as the massive crane truck turned onto Meadowbrook Lane, and my stomach dropped when I saw her standing in the middle of the street with her arms crossed like some kind of suburban traffic cop. Margaret Pemberton, the Homeowners Association president of Sunset Ridge Estates in Phoenix, Arizona, had positioned herself directly in the path of my delivery, and I knew this was about to become the worst Tuesday of my life. My name is Quentin Anderson, and I run a custom pool construction business that specializes in luxury backyard installations throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. I had been planning this crane delivery for 3 months, coordinating with the city, my contractors, and the HOA, or so I thought. The permit paperwork sat in a neat folder on my passenger seat. Every signature obtained, every fee paid, every regulation followed to the letter. This crane was supposed to lift the prefabricated pool shell over my house and into the backyard, a job that required precision timing and approximately 4 hours of street access. The crane company charged by the hour, and every minute of delay was costing me real money. I grabbed my hard hat and the folder, then jogged down my driveway toward where Margaret stood blocking the truck. She wore white capri pants and a lavender blouse that probably cost more than my monthly truck payment. Her bleached blonde hair styled in that aggressive bob cut that seemed to be standard issue for HOA board members. Her face was already red, veins visible in her neck as she shouted up at the confused crane operator. "Excuse me, Margaret," I called out, trying to keep my voice level. "I have all the permits right here. This delivery was scheduled and approved 3 weeks ago." She spun around to face me, her eyes narrowed to slits. "I don't care what papers you have, Quentin. The board met yesterday and we decided that crane operations are prohibited on weekdays. You'll have to reschedule for a Saturday." My jaw dropped. That's not in the HOA bylaws. I checked every single regulation before I scheduled this, and the crane company doesn't work Saturdays. This is a specialized piece of equipment that took months to book. "Well, perhaps you should have consulted with me personally before making such arrangements," Margaret snapped. "As HOA president, I have the authority to modify regulations as needed for the safety and well-being of our community." The crane operator, a weathered man in his 50s named Carlos, leaned out of his cab. "Look, buddy, I've got 2 more jobs today. If this lady doesn't move, I'm going to have to charge you a cancellation fee and reschedule. That's $3,000 down the drain plus whatever the next available date costs." I felt panic rising in my chest. My clients were scheduled to return from their vacation in 5 days, expecting to find their dream pool installed and ready for use. The construction crew was supposed to start the plumbing and electrical work tomorrow morning. A delay now would cascade into weeks of problems and potentially tens of thousands of dollars in penalties. "Margaret, please be reasonable," I said, holding up the folder. "I have a letter from the city, a traffic control permit, and the original approval from the HOA board signed by you 2 months ago. This is all completely legal and proper." She snatched the folder from my hands and barely glanced at it before tossing it onto the ground, papers scattering across the asphalt. "Those approvals are void. I'm invoking emergency authority under Section 12.7 of the bylaws." "Section 12.7 is about hurricane preparedness," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "We're in Arizona. We don't have hurricanes." "Extreme weather events," she corrected smugly. "It's supposed to reach 108 degrees today." That qualifies as extreme. By this point, neighbors had started emerging from their houses, drawn by the commotion. I recognized Tom and Sandra Mitchell from 3 houses down, both still in their bathrobes. The Johnsons stood on their front porch, their teenage daughter filming everything on her phone. Old Mr. Hendricks from across the street had settled into his lawn chair with a beer, apparently ready to enjoy the show. Carlos climbed down from his crane truck, clipboard in hand. "I need a decision in the next 2 minutes or I'm pulling out. I've got a crew waiting on me in Scottsdale." "Margaret, you're being completely unreasonable," I said, trying one more time. "Please just move so we can complete this job." "I will not move," she declared, planting her feet wider apart. "And if you attempt to proceed, I'll have you arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. That crane could kill someone." "Only if someone is stupid enough to stand directly underneath it," I muttered, immediately regretting the words. Her face turned an even deeper shade of crimson. "How dare you? I'm calling the police right now to have you removed for harassment and threatening behavior." She pulled out her phone, but I was already dialing 911 myself. If this situation was going to involve law enforcement, I wanted to make sure my side of the story was on record first. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, her voice professional and calm. "911, what's your emergency?" "This is Quentin Anderson at 4217 Meadowbrook Lane in Sunset Ridge Estates. I have a permitted crane delivery that's being physically blocked by my HOA president. She's standing in the middle of the street refusing to move, and I'm losing thousands of dollars by the minute." "Is anyone in immediate danger?" "Not yet, but she's threatening to falsely report me for assault, and she's creating a public disturbance. I have all my permits and documentation. This is completely legal work." The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line while she sent a unit. I could hear Margaret on her own phone, her voice shrill as she painted a very different picture of the situation. According to her version, I was an aggressive contractor who had shown up unannounced with dangerous equipment and was threatening to run her over when she tried to enforce community safety regulations. Carlos had backed away from both of us, clearly wanting no part of this dispute. "1 minute," he called out. "Then I'm gone." 2 police cruisers arrived within 5 minutes, lights flashing but sirens off. The officers who emerged were a study in contrasts. The first was a tall, muscular man in his 40s with graying temples and the relaxed posture of someone who had seen everything. His name tag read Officer Davis. The second was a younger woman, probably in her late 20s, with sharp eyes that immediately began cataloging every detail of the scene. Her tag said Officer Rodriguez. Margaret rushed toward them immediately, her hands fluttering dramatically. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man is attempting to operate heavy machinery in a residential zone without proper authorization. He's been verbally abusive and threatening. I'm the president of our homeowners association, and I'm simply trying to protect our community." Officer Davis held up one hand, his expression neutral. "Madam, I need you to step back onto the sidewalk while we assess the situation." He turned to me. "You called this in," I nodded, bending to gather the scattered papers from my permit folder. "Yes, sir. I have a crane delivery scheduled and fully permitted for today. All the paperwork is in order." "She's blocking the truck and refusing to move." Officer Rodriguez took my folder and began examining each document carefully, while Officer Davis spoke with Carlos to get his version of events. The crane operator explained the situation concisely, emphasizing that he was on a tight schedule and needed resolution quickly. "These permits all appear legitimate," Officer Rodriguez said, looking up from the paperwork. "City permit, traffic control authorization, HOA approval dated 2 months ago signed by." She glanced at Margaret. "Signed by you, Miss Pemberton." "That approval is rescinded," Margaret insisted. "I have the authority to modify HOA regulations as circumstances require." Officer Davis joined his partner, reviewing the documents himself. "Did you provide written notice to Mr. Anderson that the approval was being rescinded?" Margaret hesitated for just a moment too long. "The board met yesterday. I was planning to send notification today." "So as of this moment, he has valid authorization to proceed with this work," Officer Davis said. "It wasn't a question." "But I'm exercising emergency authority," Margaret protested. "Madam, there's no emergency here," Officer Rodriguez said patiently. "And you're currently blocking a public street and interfering with lawfully permitted work. I'm going to need you to move to the sidewalk." Margaret's expression shifted from righteous indignation to genuine shock. "You're taking his side. I'm a respected member of this community. I'm a licensed veterinarian with a practice in downtown Phoenix. I'm on 3 different charity boards. You can't speak to me like this." "I'm not taking anyone's side," Officer Rodriguez said, her tone becoming firmer. "I'm enforcing the law. You need to clear the street now." "I will not," Margaret said, crossing her arms again. "I'm protecting my neighbors from this dangerous situation." The 2 officers exchanged a look that suggested they'd dealt with this type of situation before. Officer Davis sighed. "Madam, if you don't comply, we'll have no choice but to place you under arrest for obstruction." I watched Margaret's face cycle through several emotions: disbelief, anger, fear, and finally settling on defiance. She actually seemed to believe that her position as HOA president granted her some kind of legal immunity. The gathered neighbors had grown to nearly 24 people now, several filming on their phones, creating a semicircle of witnesses around the unfolding drama. "You wouldn't dare arrest me," Margaret said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. "I know the police commissioner. I'll have your badges for this harassment." Officer Rodriguez pulled out her handcuffs. "Last warning, madam. Clear the street voluntarily or you'll be placed under arrest." What happened next still plays in slow motion in my memory. Margaret's face contorted with rage, and she lunged toward Officer Rodriguez, reaching for the documents still in the officer's hand. It was a monumentally stupid move. Officer Rodriguez sidestepped smoothly, and Officer Davis moved in to restrain Margaret. She began screaming and flailing, her designer sunglasses flying off and clattering onto the pavement. "Let me go. Police brutality. Everyone is seeing this. I'm being assaulted." Margaret shrieked as Officer Davis efficiently secured the handcuffs around her wrists. "Madam, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, interfering with permitted work, and assaulting an officer," Officer Rodriguez said in that same calm, professional tone. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The Miranda rights continued as Margaret kept screaming, threatening lawsuits, demanding to speak to supervisors, and insisting this was all a massive misunderstanding. The neighbors watched in stunned silence. I saw several people whispering to each other, and the Johnson girl was definitely still filming everything. A 3rd police car arrived, apparently called by the first officers as backup. This new officer helped escort Margaret to one of the cruisers. She continued shouting even as they placed her in the back seat, her voice muffled but still audible through the closed door. Officer Davis approached me, handing back my folder of permits. "You're clear to proceed with your work, Mr. Anderson. We'll need a statement from you and the driver for our report." "Of course," I said, still processing what had just happened. "Is she really going to face charges for this?" "That'll be up to the district attorney's office, but assault on an officer is taken seriously," Officer Rodriguez said. "Even if it's just grabbing at papers, it's still physical contact during an attempt to interfere with duties. Combined with the obstruction charges, she's looking at potential criminal charges, not just a citation." Carlos had already returned to his crane truck, apparently satisfied that he could now complete his job. "We good to go?" he called down. I looked at the officers, who nodded. "Yes, let's get this done." The rest of the morning proceeded smoothly, at least from a construction standpoint. Carlos maneuvered the crane into position with practiced precision, the massive arm extending over my house. The pool shell, a beautiful kidney-shaped design in azure blue, lifted into the air like it weighed nothing. Neighbors watched from safe distances as it floated over my roof and settled perfectly into the excavated hole in my backyard. The whole operation took 3.5 hours, exactly as planned. But my mind kept drifting back to Margaret being driven away in handcuffs, still screaming about injustice and conspiracy. I gave my statement to Officer Davis, carefully recounting the entire confrontation, the timeline of permits, and Margaret's increasingly erratic behavior. Carlos provided a similar statement, emphasizing that at no point had I acted aggressively or inappropriately. After the crane truck pulled away and the officers had left, several neighbors approached me. Tom Mitchell was the first, his expression a mixture of sympathy and vindication. "Quentin, I've got to tell you, that was about the most satisfying thing I've seen in 5 years of living under Margaret's reign of terror," he said quietly. "Last year she threatened to fine me $200 a day because my grass was a 1/4 inch too tall according to her personal measurement. Not the HOA guidelines, her personal standard." Sandra nodded vigorously. "She reported us to code enforcement claiming we were running an illegal business because I sell crafts on Etsy. From inside our house. They had to waste time investigating because she filed an official complaint." Other stories poured out as more neighbors gathered. The Johnsons had been fined for having their trash cans visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though they'd been loading their car for a trip and had them out for less than an hour. Old Mr. Hendricks had been threatened with foreclosure over a $5 late fee on his HOA dues that he'd never received notice about. A young couple at the end of the street had been denied approval to install a wheelchair ramp for their disabled daughter because it didn't match the aesthetic standards of the community. "Someone needs to do something about her," a woman named Patricia said. "She's turned this HOA into her personal fiefdom. The rest of the board is too scared to stand up to her." I learned that Margaret had been HOA president for 6 years, having essentially bullied or manipulated her way into power, and then maintained it through a combination of intimidation and strategic alliance building. She owned her veterinary clinic outright, a successful practice that treated everything from household pets to exotic animals, which had given her both financial independence and social standing in the broader Phoenix community. That success seemed to have convinced her that rules applying to ordinary people didn't apply to her. The next few days were a blur of construction activity. My crew worked efficiently, installing the plumbing, electrical systems, and finishing work that would transform the pool from a fiberglass shell to a backyard oasis. But alongside the physical work, a legal drama was unfolding that I only learned about in pieces. Margaret had been released on her own recognizance after being booked and processed at the Maricopa County Jail. According to courthouse records that became public, she'd been charged with obstruction of justice, interfering with permitted work, disorderly conduct, and misdemeanor assault on a peace officer. Her arraignment was scheduled for 2 weeks later. What I didn't expect was the phone call I received 3 days after the incident. The number showed up as coming from the Arizona State Veterinary Medical Examining Board. I answered cautiously. "Mr. Anderson, this is Dr. Patricia Chen from the State Veterinary Board." I'm calling regarding an incident involving Dr. Margaret Pemberton. We understand you were the complainant in a case that resulted in her arrest. I wouldn't say complainant exactly, I said carefully. I called the police because she was blocking my permitted work. What happened after that was based on her own actions. Of course, Dr. Chen said. I'm not calling about the criminal case itself. However, the board has become aware of the situation, and when we began looking into Dr. Pemberton's recent activities, some concerning patterns emerged. Would you be willing to speak with an investigator about her behavior and any interactions you've had with her in her capacity as HOA president? I agreed, curious about where this was heading. 2 days later, an investigator named James Wu sat in my living room, a digital recorder on the coffee table between us. He was a serious man in his early 50s, with the careful demeanor of someone who took his job very seriously. Let me explain why we're here, James began. The Veterinary Medical Board doesn't typically involve itself in HOA disputes. However, Dr. Pemberton holds a professional license that requires adherence to certain ethical standards, including honesty, integrity, and mental stability sufficient to practice veterinary medicine. When a licensee is arrested, particularly for charges involving assault on a peace officer, we have an obligation to investigate. He pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be complaint records. What really caught our attention, though, was the pattern. You're not the first person in your neighborhood to have serious issues with Dr. Pemberton, and some of those issues have potential relevance to her fitness to practice. Over the next hour, James walked me through a series of complaints that had been filed with various agencies over the past 3 years. Margaret had allegedly falsified documents on multiple occasions to support her HOA rulings. She'd claimed to have engineering reports that didn't exist to deny construction permits. She'd forged signatures on letters supposedly from concerned neighbors. Most disturbingly, she'd apparently used her veterinary credentials to make false claims about health hazards to shut down activities she personally opposed. There was an incident last year, James said, where a family wanted to install a koi pond. Dr. Pemberton claimed that koi ponds posed a serious disease transmission risk, and that, as a licensed veterinarian, she had authority to deny it on public health grounds. The family backed down, not wanting to fight. But when our investigator looked into it, there's no legitimate veterinary basis for that claim. Properly maintained koi ponds pose no more disease risk than any other water feature. So she was using her professional credentials to give weight to personal preferences, I asked. Exactly. And that's a violation of professional ethics. Your case was just the catalyst that made us look deeper. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I need to ask you some detailed questions about your interactions with her, particularly her mental state during the confrontation. Several witnesses have suggested her behavior was erratic beyond simple anger. I recounted the entire incident in detail, from her initial blocking of the crane truck to her increasingly irrational statements about emergency authority and hurricane protocols in a desert climate. I described how she'd thrown my papers on the ground, her threats about false assault charges, and finally her physical lunge toward Officer Rodriguez. James took extensive notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he sat back with a troubled expression. This fits with other accounts we've received. I have to tell you, Mr. Anderson, we're building a case for emergency license suspension pending a full hearing. Dr. Pemberton's behavior suggests either a serious lapse in judgment or potentially underlying mental health issues that could affect her ability to safely practice veterinary medicine. A veterinarian having a breakdown while treating an animal could result in serious harm or death to that animal. The implications were staggering. I just wanted to install a pool. Now my HOA president was facing criminal charges and potentially losing her entire career. Margaret's criminal trial was scheduled quickly, as these matters went. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Amanda Torres, had apparently decided to make an example of the case. I learned this from Officer Rodriguez, who called to let me know I'd need to testify. The district attorney's office sees this as part of a larger pattern of entitled behavior from people in positions of minor authority, she explained. HOA presidents, small-time officials, people who think their little bit of power puts them above the law. They want to send a message. The trial took place in a Maricopa County courthouse on a sweltering July morning 6 weeks after the initial incident. I wore my best suit, uncomfortable in the air-conditioned courtroom after arriving sticky with sweat from the parking lot. Margaret sat at the defense table with her attorney, an expensive-looking man in a three-piece suit who apparently specialized in professional licensing issues. The prosecution's case was straightforward and damning. They called Carlos first, who testified about the blocking of his crane truck and Margaret's refusal to move despite having no legal authority to stop the work. Then, Officer Davis took the stand, describing the escalating situation and Margaret's repeated refusals to comply with lawful orders. Officer Rodriguez followed, providing detailed testimony about Margaret's physical contact during the attempted grab for the documents. Then, it was my turn. The prosecutor walked me through the entire timeline, establishing that I'd done everything correctly, obtained all proper permits, and given Margaret every opportunity to resolve things peacefully. The defense attorney tried to make me seem like an aggressive contractor who'd provoked his client, but the documented evidence and multiple witness videos made that narrative impossible to sustain. The most damaging testimony came from several of my neighbors. The prosecution had apparently interviewed dozens of residents from Sunset Ridge Estates, and they'd selected the most compelling stories. Tom Mitchell described 3 years of harassment and arbitrary fines. A woman named Rachel Foster testified about how Margaret had tried to force her to remove a memorial garden for her deceased son because the flowers weren't on the approved plant list. An elderly man named George Watkins, barely able to climb into the witness box, described with tears in his eyes how Margaret had threatened to foreclose on his home over a minor violation while he was recovering from cancer treatment. By the time the prosecution rested, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted dramatically. This wasn't just about blocking a crane truck anymore. It was about abuse of power, harassment, and a pattern of bullying that had poisoned an entire community. The jury members' expressions ranged from sympathy to outright disgust. The defense tried to paint Margaret as a dedicated community servant who'd simply reached her breaking point after years of thankless service. They called character witnesses who testified about her successful veterinary practice and her charity work. But on cross-examination, the prosecution got several of them to admit they didn't actually live in Sunset Ridge Estates and had no knowledge of her behavior as HOA president. Margaret herself took the stand, which seemed to surprise her own attorney. It was a disaster from the first question. She couldn't help herself from being condescending and defensive, from referring to the residents as ungrateful and insisting she'd been protecting property values through strict enforcement. When the prosecutor asked why she'd physically grabbed at Officer Rodriguez, she actually said, "That policewoman was being disrespectful. Someone needed to teach her proper deference to community leaders." The courtroom went dead silent. Even her attorney looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. The prosecutor didn't even follow up with another question, just smiled slightly and said, "No further questions, Your Honor." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found Margaret guilty on all charges: obstruction of justice, interfering with permitted work, disorderly conduct, and misdemeanor assault on a peace officer. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, but made it clear she was not inclined toward leniency. "Miss Pemberton," the judge said, her voice hard, "you abused a position of trust within your community. You harassed and intimidated people who had every right to peacefully enjoy their homes. And when lawful authority attempted to correct your behavior, you responded with violence. This court takes such matters very seriously." I sat in the gallery, watching Margaret's face crumble as the reality of her situation finally penetrated. Her attorney was already whispering urgently to her, probably about appeals, but she just stared straight ahead like she couldn't quite believe this was happening. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later was almost anticlimactic. The judge imposed 60 days in county jail, suspended after 30 days served with credit for time served, 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a $5,000 fine. She was also required to resign immediately from any position of authority in the Sunset Ridge Estates, HOA, and was permanently barred from serving on the board. But the criminal conviction was only the beginning of Margaret's problems. The same day as her sentencing, the Arizona State Veterinary Medical Examining Board issued an emergency suspension of her license to practice veterinary medicine. The order, which became public record, cited conduct reflecting unfavorably on the profession, dishonesty in professional dealings, and demonstrated inability to practice veterinary medicine with reasonable skill and safety. The board scheduled a formal hearing for 3 months later to determine whether the suspension would become permanent revocation. In the meantime, Margaret's clinic had to either close or operate under another veterinarian supervision. According to the Phoenix Business News, she chose to sell the practice outright to her associate veterinarian, taking a significant financial loss in the rushed sale. I attended the veterinary board hearing, partly out of curiosity and partly because James Wu had asked me to be available in case my testimony was needed. The hearing room was smaller than a courtroom but just as formal, with the board members seated at a raised table facing Margaret and her attorney. The board presented their case methodically, documenting years of ethical violations in Margaret's capacity as HOA president. The forged documents, the misuse of professional credentials to support personal preferences, the pattern of harassment and abuse of authority. They brought in a psychologist who'd evaluated Margaret as part of the criminal proceedings. His testimony was careful but damning. "Dr. Pemberton displays symptoms consistent with narcissistic personality disorder with authoritarian tendencies," he said. "She has an inflated sense of self-importance, a deep need for admiration and control, and a profound lack of empathy for others. While this doesn't render her legally insane, it does raise serious questions about her judgment, particularly in situations where she has authority over vulnerable beings, whether human or animal." The defense attempted to argue that Margaret's behavior as HOA president was completely separate from her work as a veterinarian, that she'd never had any complaints about her veterinary care, and that the board was overreaching. But the board's attorney countered effectively. "A veterinarian holds a position of trust," the attorney argued. "Pet owners rely on veterinary professionals to make life and death decisions about beings who cannot speak for themselves. Dr. Pemberton has demonstrated through her documented pattern of behavior that she cannot be trusted with that kind of authority. She lies when it suits her purposes. She falsifies documents. She uses her credentials to bully people into compliance. What happens when a pet owner questions her recommended treatment? What happens when an animal shelter challenges her assessment? The potential for abuse is too great. The board deliberated for 2 days before issuing their decision. It was read aloud by Dr. Chen, the same woman who'd first called me months earlier. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, this board finds that Dr. Margaret Pemberton has violated multiple provisions of the Arizona Veterinary Practice Act. Specifically, she has engaged in conduct that reflects unfavorably upon the profession, has been guilty of dishonesty in professional dealings through the misuse of her credentials, and has demonstrated behavior suggesting impairment in her ability to practice with reasonable skill and safety. Therefore, the board orders that Dr. Pemberton's license to practice veterinary medicine in the state of Arizona is hereby revoked, effective immediately. She may petition for reinstatement no sooner than 5 years from this date, subject to completion of psychological evaluation and treatment, demonstration of ethical rehabilitation, and approval by this board. Margaret's face was expressionless as the decision was read, but her hands trembled in her lap. Her attorney made some perfunctory statements about potential appeals, but everyone in the room knew this was over. A career built over decades had been destroyed in less than a year, all stemming from her inability to let a crane truck deliver a pool shell. Life in Sunset Ridge Estates changed dramatically after Margaret's removal. The HOA board held an emergency election, and a retired accountant named Stephen Berkeley was voted in as the new president. His first act was to commission a full review of all of Margaret's rulings over her 6-year tenure. The review uncovered hundreds of violations, false citations, and improperly imposed fines. The board ended up issuing refunds totaling over $40,000 to residents who'd been wrongly penalized. They also formally apologized and rescinded dozens of denials for reasonable home improvements. The young couple with the disabled daughter finally got their wheelchair ramp approved. Tom Mitchell planted whatever grass length he wanted without fear of arbitrary measurement. Rachel Foster's memorial garden was officially recognized as a beautiful community feature. I finished my pool installation, and my clients returned to find it perfect and ready for use. They left me a glowing review and referred 3 of their friends, more than making up for the stress of that Tuesday morning confrontation. The pool became something of a neighborhood landmark, and I found myself hosting an impromptu community gathering that summer. Nearly 50 residents showed up, many of them people I'd never formally met, but who wanted to thank me for inadvertently freeing them from Margaret's tyranny. You know what the crazy thing is? Tom Mitchell said to me at that gathering, beer in hand as we watched kids splashing in the pool. She could have just let you do your job. That's all you wanted. Instead, she had to turn it into a power play, and it cost her everything. He was right. If Margaret had simply stayed in her house that morning, or even come out to verify my permits, and then let me proceed, none of this would have happened. She'd still be a successful veterinarian. She'd still be HOA president. She'd still have her reputation and her authority. But she couldn't help herself. The need to control, to dominate, to prove that she was in charge had been more powerful than common sense or self-preservation. I ran into Margaret one more time, about 8 months after the initial incident. I was shopping for construction supplies at a Home Depot in Phoenix when I saw her in the garden section, examining bags of soil. She looked older, more tired, the aggressive confidence completely gone from her posture. She saw me at the same moment I saw her, and for a few seconds we just stood there. "Hello, Quentin," she said finally, her voice quiet. "Margaret," I acknowledged, not sure what else to say. She set down the bag of soil she'd been holding. "I suppose you're satisfied with how things turned out." "I'm not satisfied or dissatisfied," I said honestly. "I just wanted to install a pool. Everything else was your choice." She flinched slightly at that. "I've been in therapy, court-ordered at first, but I've kept going. My therapist says I have issues with control and authority." She laughed bitterly. "No kidding, right? Apparently it stems from my childhood, from never feeling like I had any power over my own life. So when I finally got some authority as an adult, I went overboard." "That's good that you're working on it," I said carefully. "Getting help." "My career is gone. My reputation is destroyed. I had to sell my house in Sunset Ridge and move to an apartment in Temp, all because I couldn't let you install a pool." She shook her head. "The worst part is, I don't even care about pools. I don't care about grass height or trash cans or any of it. I just cared about being in charge, about people following my rules. How pathetic is that?" I didn't have an answer for her. Part of me felt sympathy for this broken woman in front of me. But another part remembered Tom Mitchell talking about foreclosure threats while recovering from cancer, and Rachel Foster's memorial garden that had been deemed unacceptable, and all the other people who'd suffered under Margaret's reign. "I hope therapy helps you," I said finally. "I really do. But what you did to people, Margaret, that wasn't just about control issues. You hurt people. You made their lives miserable for years, and you never seemed to care." "I know," she said softly. "I'm working on understanding why I couldn't see that then. Why other people's feelings didn't seem real to me." She picked up her bag of soil again. "I'm growing vegetables now, in containers on my apartment balcony, something about nurturing life instead of controlling people. My therapist suggested it." We said awkward goodbyes, and I watched her walk toward the checkout lines, shoulders hunched, looking nothing like the imperious woman who'd stood in the middle of Meadowbrook Lane with her arms crossed, and her certainty that she was right. I felt a complicated mixture of emotions, but mostly, I just felt relieved that this chapter of my life was over. The story became something of a legend in Phoenix contracting circles. I'd be on job sites, and other contractors would bring it up, having heard various versions through the grapevine. Some of the details got exaggerated in the retelling. In one version I'd heard, Margaret had tried to physically climb onto the crane truck. In another, she'd thrown punches at 3 officers. I always corrected the record when I could, emphasizing that, while Margaret's behavior had been bad, the truth was dramatic enough without embellishment. Officer Rodriguez called me about a year later, not about Margaret but about a different HOA situation where she needed advice on permitted work documentation. We ended up getting coffee, and she told me that the department had actually used the incident as a training example. "It's a perfect case study," she explained. "Dealing with someone who believes their minor authority gives them major power, de-escalation techniques, proper documentation procedures, everything. And it shows why we can't back down just because someone claims to be important or threatens to know the police commissioner." "Did Margaret actually know the police commissioner?" I asked, curious. Rodriguez laughed. "She knew his name, which she probably got from the department website. They'd never met. That was pure bluff, and a stupid one. Threatening officers with their boss's wrath is never going to end well. The HOA itself underwent major reforms. Stephen Berkeley implemented new bylaws requiring board decisions to be made collectively rather than by presidential fiat, established an appeals process for contested violations, and created transparency requirements for all communications with residents. The changes were so successful that several other Phoenix area HOAs adopted similar reforms, using Sunset Ridge Estates as a model for how to run a homeowners association that actually served its community rather than oppressing it. I expanded my pool business significantly in the following years, hiring additional crews and taking on larger commercial projects. The publicity from the incident, while initially stressful, had actually raised my profile. People knew I was a contractor who did things by the book, who stood up to unreasonable opposition, and who completed projects professionally regardless of obstacles. That reputation was worth more than any advertising I could have bought. My personal life improved too. The stress of dealing with Margaret's harassment had been affecting me in ways I hadn't fully recognized. I'd been short-tempered with employees, anxious about every new project, constantly worried about HOA interference. With that weight lifted, I found myself enjoying my work again, taking time for hobbies, even starting to date after years of being too busy and stressed to think about relationships. I met Maria Ortega at a friend's barbecue about 2 years after the incident. She was a civil engineer who specialized in water management systems, brilliant and funny, and completely unimpressed by my minor local fame as the guy who got the HOA president arrested. We bonded over shared experiences with difficult clients and bureaucratic nightmares, and within 6 months, we were inseparable. When I proposed to Maria, we actually considered buying a house in a non-HOA neighborhood. But Stephen Berkeley had turned Sunset Ridge Estates into such a pleasant place to live that I decided to stay. We bought a larger house 3 streets over from my original place, one with enough space for the family we were planning. The HOA approval for our wedding reception in the community center took exactly 3 days and required minimal paperwork. Stephen even attended the reception, bringing a thoughtful gift and congratulating us warmly. You know, in a strange way, that whole mess with Margaret was the best thing that ever happened to this community, Stephen told me that night, glass of champagne in hand. It forced us to confront what we'd become, to recognize that we'd let fear turn our HOA into a dictatorship. Now we actually function the way these organizations are supposed to, as a cooperative body that maintains standards without crushing individuality. He was right. Property values in Sunset Ridge Estates had actually increased faster than comparable neighborhoods in the years since Margaret's removal, likely because word had spread that it was now a pleasant place to live rather than a prison ruled by a petty tyrant. The community felt lighter, friendlier. People actually used their yards and common areas instead of hiding inside, afraid of triggering some obscure violation. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Margaret had eventually moved away from Phoenix entirely, relocating to Oregon or Washington, somewhere she could start completely fresh. The veterinary license revocation followed her, of course, part of the national database that all state boards checked, but apparently she'd found work in animal shelter administration, a position that didn't require a veterinary license but still allowed her to work with animals. I hoped she'd found some peace and learned from her mistakes. I harbored no ongoing ill will toward her, just a sense of relief that the situation had resolved without anyone being seriously hurt. The pool I'd fought so hard to install remained one of my favorite projects, not because of the installation itself, but because of what it represented. Every contractor faces obstacles, difficult clients, permit issues, weather delays, and countless other challenges. But that particular project had tested me in ways I'd never anticipated. It had forced me to stand firm, document everything, follow procedures exactly, and ultimately trust that the system would work if I worked within it properly. Young contractors sometimes asked me for advice about dealing with difficult HOAs, and I always told them the same thing. Do everything by the book. Get every permit, every signature, every approval in writing. Document everything. Be professional even when the other person isn't. And if someone tries to stop you from doing legal, permitted work, don't back down, but don't escalate either. Call the authorities and let them handle it. It was advice born from experience, from watching Margaret destroy her own life through escalation and illegal behavior when all she'd had to do was follow the rules. The irony was that she'd been obsessed with enforcing rules on others while ignoring the laws that applied to her. She demanded documentation from residents while falsifying her own documents. She'd insisted on compliance while being utterly non-compliant herself. 5 years after the initial incident, I was invited to speak at a conference for HOA board members in Phoenix. The organizers wanted me to share my experience from a contractor's perspective, discussing how boards could work constructively with residents on home improvement projects rather than creating adversarial relationships. I almost declined, not wanting to relive that stressful period, but Maria convinced me to accept. You have real insight to share, she said. And maybe you can prevent other communities from going down the path Sunset Ridge Estates went down under Margaret. The speech went well. I talked about the importance of clear, written policies, the danger of allowing any single person too much authority, and the need for boards to remember they were serving their communities, not ruling them. I shared the story of the crane truck incident, getting some gasps and nervous laughter from the audience. But I emphasized that I didn't see Margaret as a villain, just as someone who'd let a small amount of power corrupt her judgment, and that any of them could fall into similar traps if they weren't vigilant about their own behavior. During the question and answer session, a woman raised her hand. She was probably in her 50s, well-dressed, with the confident air of someone used to being in charge. How do you balance enforcing standards with being flexible? She asked. I'm on my HOA board, and sometimes I feel like if we give an inch, everyone will take a mile. It was a fair question, and I considered it carefully before answering. I think the key is distinguishing between standards that genuinely protect property values and community well-being versus rules that exist just to control people. Does it really matter if someone's grass is a 1/4 inch too tall? No. Does it matter if someone wants to paint their house neon orange? Maybe yes, because that actually affects neighbors. Focus on the things that truly matter and be reasonable about the rest. Another board member asked about dealing with residents who seemed to constantly push boundaries. I shared the perspective I'd gained over years of working in HOA communities. Some people will always be difficult. But in my experience, most people just want to improve their homes and live peacefully. If your residents seem constantly combative, you might want to examine whether your rules and enforcement are reasonable. Margaret thought everyone in Sunset Ridge Estates was ungrateful and difficult. Turned out, they were just tired of being harassed. The conference organizers told me later that the feedback on my presentation was overwhelmingly positive, with several board members saying it had made them reconsider their approach to community governance. One person wrote that my story had been a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of petty power, which seemed like a fair assessment. Life continued to improve. Maria and I welcomed our first child, a daughter named Sophie, and I found myself grateful every day that we lived in a community where I didn't have to worry about HOA harassment over a stroller on the porch or a baby swing in the yard. Stephen Berkeley, still HOA president, actually organized a community baby shower for us, with dozens of neighbors contributing gifts and advice. The crane company that had delivered my pool shell, the one Carlos worked for, started referring me to other clients, telling them I was a contractor who handled complications professionally. That referral network became one of my most valuable business assets, leading to dozens of high-value projects over the years. Carlos and I stayed in touch, occasionally grabbing lunch when his delivery routes brought him near my office. He loved telling the story of the block delivery, always emphasizing the dramatic moment when Margaret lunged at Officer Rodriguez. "I've been operating cranes for 30 years, he'd say, shaking his head. "Dealt with traffic, weather, equipment failures, all kinds of problems. But that was the only time I've ever seen someone get arrested during a delivery. And the thing was, it was all so unnecessary. She literally just had to not stand in the middle of the street. The legal system had worked exactly as it should have." Margaret had received due process, professional representation, and fair hearings at every stage. The consequences she'd faced weren't the result of vindictive prosecution or kangaroo courts, but of her own documented actions and their natural legal implications. The jury that convicted her had deliberated carefully. The judge who sentenced her had considered all factors. The veterinary board that revoked her license had given her multiple opportunities to explain herself. At every step, she'd been treated fairly, and at every step, the evidence of her misconduct had been overwhelming. Officer Davis retired a few years later, and his retirement party included a slideshow of memorable cases. The image of Margaret being led to the patrol car in handcuffs made an appearance, getting both laughter and applause from his fellow officers. Someone had captioned it, "The Great Crane Standoff of 2026, turning it into departmental legend." Officer Rodriguez, who'd been promoted to detective, told me she still used the incident in training sessions, emphasizing the importance of staying calm under pressure and following procedure regardless of who was claiming what authority. I sometimes wondered what would have happened if I'd given in that day, if I'd told Carlos to leave and tried to reschedule everything. Would Margaret have taken it as validation of her authority? Would she have become even more aggressive with other residents? Or would she have continued operating as she had been until someone else finally pushed back? I'd never know for certain, but I suspected that confrontation had been inevitable. Margaret's behavior had been escalating for years, and eventually she was going to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The pool itself remained beautiful and functional, a centerpiece of my backyard where Sophie learned to swim and where we hosted countless gatherings of friends and family. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded not just of the confrontation that had nearly prevented its installation, but of the principle I'd stood for, that following the rules and doing things properly should protect you, that the law should apply equally to everyone regardless of their position or self-importance, and that abusing authority ultimately carries consequences. Sunset Ridge Estates continued to thrive under new leadership. The community garden that residents had wanted for years, but Margaret had blocked, was finally installed. Families were approved for solar panels, electric car chargers, and other modern improvements that made sense. The HOA still maintained standards, but they were enforced reasonably and consistently, with clear communication and fair processes. It had become a model for what an HOA could be at its best, a cooperative body that genuinely enhanced the community rather than oppressing it. As for Margaret, I truly hoped she'd found some measure of peace and self-awareness. The last I'd heard, she was volunteering at animal shelters in addition to her administrative work, had maintained her therapy sessions, and was apparently in a healthier place emotionally than she'd been during her years of power in Phoenix. Losing everything had been a brutal teacher, but sometimes brutal lessons are the only ones that get through. Standing in my backyard one warm evening, watching Sophie splash in the pool while Maria relaxed on a lounge chair with a book, I reflected on how much had changed since that Tuesday morning when I'd watched a woman in white capri pants plant herself in front of a crane truck. That single moment of stubbornness had cascaded into life-changing consequences for multiple people. It had destroyed one career, reformed an entire community, launched investigations that protected future HOA residents, and taught me lessons about standing firm for what was right that had shaped the rest of my life. The sun set over the Phoenix horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The pool water reflected the colors, shimmering and beautiful. And I felt profoundly grateful for how everything had turned out, for the community we'd built from the ashes of Margaret's tyranny, for the family I was raising in an environment of reason rather than fear, and for the simple but important truth that had been proven that day. Nobody, no matter how self-important, is above the law or immune to consequences when they abuse whatever small power they've been given.